Passover Seder Talk. This is Rabbi Pearl. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to share ideas, concepts from Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, to be able to uplift our Seder, to make our Seder experience meaningful and lasting with us for the entire year. The concept of leaving Egypt, not only do we make a focus on Passover, remembering the freedom, but we live it continuously on a daily basis. Therefore, when we look and celebrate Passover, particularly the Seder, we are very careful to put as much focus as possible to learn the depth, the meaning, to be really exhilarated. And the word Seder means order. And when we properly appreciate what the Seder is all about, it puts order not only to the evening, but also for the entire year ahead. So let us begin. The Kabbalah of the Seder plate. Stories are important, especially when we share stories about the Jewish past. They help us reach over the centuries, and in a sense, by telling the stories, we take part in the experiences of our ancestors. And of course, these stories also generate an awareness of our heritage and enable us to draw inspiration to face our situations as Jewish people in our current times. But how many ways are there to tell a story? The obvious way is to tell it in words. And in this, the story told at the Seder meal is no exception. What we do and what we experience at the Seder. And indeed, the whole purpose of the Seder is to tell the story of our ancestors' slavery and the release from Egypt. In fact, the very word Haggadah means to tell. Yet, I'm here to share with you there's another non-verbal method of telling the same story. And that brings us to the items of food on the Seder table, because they too tell a story. For they are not only things to be eaten, but in fact, each of the foods sitting on the Seder table is a symbol calling to mind certain core ideas that are so important in when we experience and celebrate Passover at the Seder. As we refer to these symbols in our Haggadah and eat them at certain key points during the narrative, in fact, they reinforce for us, each in its own unique way, the central concepts of what Passover is all about. The core ideas of Passover is, of course, slavery and freedom. People often say that Passover is the time for celebrating freedom. This is not entirely correct. On Passover, we are actually celebrating the transition from slavery to freedom. Now, this is eloquently expressed in the items of the food on the table, since they have an association with both slavery and freedom. Both are represented. Let's look at the wine. The Seder begins with Kiddush, recited over wine. It's usually red wine, since this is the color of blood. Only during the Middle Ages, when the Jews were accused of using the blood of murdered non-Gentiles in the Seder, did they use white wine. But generally speaking, we use red wine. Blood has obvious associations with slavery. Our ancestors were beaten and they bled. But there is also the blood of freedom. On the night preceding the Exodus, our ancestors were commanded to kill a sheep or a goat and to smear its blood upon the doorposts of their homes. This was to be a sign that the plague of death of all the firstborn sons of Egypt would not affect any of the Israelite homes. And shortly after that, our ancestors left Egypt. Salt water. Therefore, you see, wine has both an association of slavery as well as freedom. Let's look at the salt water. The second item taken at the Seder is karpas, usually onion, parsley, or potato, dipped in salt water. Salt water calls to mind the tears of our slaveries, and so has an association with slavery. When our ancestors stepped over the border into the desert, they were not entirely free. There was always the possibility of the Egyptians chasing after them and hauling them back into slavery, which is exactly what they attempted to do. Only after our ancestors crossed the Sea of Reeds and the Egyptian army was drowned, were they entirely free? It was therefore the sea, symbolized by the salt water, which was instrumental in the final freeing of the Jewish people from Egyptian slavery. Again, the salt water has both an association with slavery and freedom. Let's look at the matzah. After eating the karpas, we break the middle matzah. Matzah is the food which our ancestors ate during their long slavery in Egypt. We even say at the beginning of the Haggadah, this is the bread of affliction which our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Maybe you visited the British Museum in England. You can see loaves of Egyptian bread preserved in the tomb of some king or noble, and looks surprisingly like the round, hand-baked shmura matzah, which many people use at the Seder. The bread in the museum is rather thick, since it was the food of the wealthy. The round matzah, being thin and much less substantial, is the bread which was given to the slaves. It took very little time to bake and very little time to eat, and so allowed the taskmasters to get the maximum working time from the slaves. But our ancestors not only ate matzah when they were slaves. After the slaying of the firstborn Egyptians, the Egyptians were so anxious to drive us out, they did not have time to bake the bread properly. So ironically, on the way out of Egypt into freedom, they found themselves eating the same matzah bread that they had eaten during the years of slavery. But this time, it was the bread of freedom. So again, this third item is a transition between slavery and freedom. Let's look at the bitter herbs. The ideal substance to use for bitter herbs is lettuce. This might surprise some people, but there is a reason for this. It is the lettuce that we find expressed in the very relationship, again, between slavery and freedom. The leaves of the lettuce are, of course, not bitter at all. In a young, fresh lettuce, they are crisp and sweet. Nonetheless, the lettuce grows from a green, white stalk, which is very, very bitter. Clearly, the crisp, sweet leaves represent freedom, and the bitter stalks represent slavery. But here is an important insight being communicated to us. Freedom can only be really appreciated when it's rooted in slavery. We who are born free often take our freedom for granted. We do not wake up each morning and say to ourselves, I am free, how wonderful. Yet someone who has been in prison would do that exactly. So it was when our ancestors left Egypt, hence the use of lettuce. Let's look at the charoses. When charoses is made properly, it has the appearance of the texture of river mud. It was from this mud that our ancestors made bricks. Again, visitors to the British Museum can see a mud brick with the straw still embedded in it, stamped with the royal seal of Ramses II, the pharaoh of the slavery. The appearance of the charoses clearly calls to mind the harsh servitude which our ancestors were subjected. But when we put the charoses in our mouth, we experience something quite different. It has a sweet taste, a taste which no slave ever experienced. Its sweetness is association and connected with freedom. Let's continue on our Seder plate. The bone and the egg, as well as the mentioned items of food, which are directly connected with slavery and the freedom dichotomy, we also have on the Seder plate a burnt egg and a roasted bone, usually the neck of a chicken. That's what exists on our Seder plate. These are not connected with slavery or freedom. Rather, they call to mind the Holy Temple, where our ancestors used to offer the Passover lamb sacrifice. It is characteristic of Jewish celebrations that there should be something to bring to mind the temple of old. It might be the glass smashed under the foot of the bridegroom at the wedding, or the salt on the table in which we dip our bread, or the egg and the bone on our Seder table. In this case, the egg represents the festive sacrifice which was offered on the 3 pilgrimage festivals, on Passover, on Shavuos, and Sukkot. The bone represents the special Passover offering and is usually roasted over an open flame as the original sacrifice was. So here, dear friends, we learn the symbols these symbols that we have on the Seder plate have a very powerful way of making ideas tangible. They have an immediacy which the spoken word alone lacks. There's something it brings to life, even more than words. The significance of the Seder meal is, as our sages tell us, that we should come to see ourselves as though we personally have left Egypt. There are, of course, many kinds of Egypts. There's material kind of Egypts, there's psychological, spiritual, and ultimately, we must break out of all of them. It is the visual and the tactile force of this symbol which helps us to come closer to our ancient roots so that we can draw inspiration from them to break out of our own personal Egypts, whatever form they might take. Let us move on. Passover, a matter of taste. What do our sages tell us? In every generation, a person is obligated to regard himself as if he had come out of Egypt. Those are the words we say in the Haggadah. Though the Seder traditionally features many tantalizing dishes, the Torah mandated foods which take center stage on Passover night are the matzah and the maror, the bit of vegetables. The rabbis completed the obligation in the Seder menu by adding 4 cups of wine to the carte du jour, the menu of the evening. Now, the event organizer apparently neglected to choose a taste theme for this evening's gathering. Why is that? Because matzah is flavorless. It's flavorless. Ugh. And that's by design. Why is that? Because the matzah is to be like pauper's bread, lechem. It may not be seasoned, nor is one allowed to add eggs, sugar, or oil to its dough, just plain flour and water. Downing the mandatory ounces of dry matzah at the Seder is not a very easy task. Maror has a taste, a very distinctively bitter taste. Wine possesses a rich taste, especially savored by those with a refined palate. So we imbibe this noble beverage to celebrate the exquisite taste of freedom that we've acquired on Passover. The event organizer apparently neglected to choose a taste theme for the evening's gathering, but now we understand why. There's something very special about having a taste, a tastelessness, and taste at the same time. Some 3,300 years ago, our ancestors left the immoral and corrupt Egypt, and we all embarked on a journey towards Mount Sinai and eventually to the Holy Land. Pharaoh's slaves were now a free people, free to receive the Torah and to realize their immense potential of what are we, dear friends, what are we? We are our ambassadors of light. We are to be a light upon the nations. That's why we left Egypt. So on this night, we relive this monumental event and endeavor to escape from our own personal Egypt, our own enslavement to whether it's our egotistical impulses, some immoral tendencies which impede our growth, and we now are able to serve Hashem, God, as free persons. The specialized cuisine consumed at the Seder is intended to assist us in achieving this holy night's grand goal. So, what is the true taste of personal redemption? Is liberation supposed to be tasteless or tasty? And if you have chosen the latter option of tasty, is redemption supposed to have a pleasant taste, or is it meant to leave a bitter taste in our mouths? Perhaps the Seder menu is teaching us there are different roads to redemption. Each one of the Seder foods and drinks is symbolic of a valid path to this desired destination of freedom. Matzah, right? No one wishes for a dry, tasteless life. We all want to feel gratified, fulfilled, and delight. However, Egypt typically leaves us with a ruined taste buds, with a destructive appetite for unhealthy tastes. More importantly, Egypt ascribes inappropriate primary aspects to taste. Matzah represents redemption, which is achieved through prioritizing and understanding that ultimately life is not about taste, but about the end game. It's not about the nice taste that we have, the pleasures that we have, but the ultimate end game, which is to serve God. In truth, a Torah life is tastier than all the alternative lifestyles, but that is a fringe benefit. Egypt cannot function without taste and pleasure, and thus prioritizing taste is a one-way ticket out of there. Maror is another level of freedom. Maror, the Egyptians embittered our lives. While the corrupting influence of Egypt may be disguised as enlightenment, progress, or the right of self-determination, it is downright painful for the Jewish soul. Allow yourself to feel your soul's pain. As Jeremiah said and pleaded, know and see that you are forsaking the Lord your God, and that is evil and bitter. Go ahead. This anguish has a therapeutic benefit. Feeling this pain will send us dashing from Egypt. We'll run so quickly that the dough won't have time to rise. So Egypt typically leaves us with a ruined taste buds, with a destructive appetite for unhealthy tastes. Wine, instead of dwelling on the bitter taste of slavery, focuses on the rich, intoxicating taste of freedom, which is entirely within reach of every one of us. Earnestly, let us think the possibility of enjoying a holy and meaningful life, a life dedicated to an ideal infinitely more important than all of our material success. Let's dwell on this thought for a while, and suddenly the Egyptian delicacies will lose much of their allure, and we'll be well on our way towards Mount Sinai. So let us choose our favorite path. Or as the great sage Hillel says, make a sandwich and eat them all together. Let us all have and put together all kinds of tastes, whether it's the bitterness, whether it's the good taste, bring it all together and experience a true freedom out of anything that limits us on the way to our Mount Sinai and to the experience of what life is all about. Allow me to continue now on an interesting dimension of the Seder. Let's call it a full page on half a matzah. A whole story over half a matzah. On Passover night, we begin the Seder by breaking the middle matzah. This important symbol, called yachatz, precedes even the saying of the Haggadah. Half of this matzah is hidden for the afikoman, which is then eaten at the end of the Seder. What's it all about? What's the meaning of all of this? All the other important parts of the Seder and the blessings are conducted now with a broken matzah. We go crazy to get full matzahs, then we go knowledgeably and knowingly go and break the matzah. But why do we take a good whole matzah and intentionally break it apart? Is it appropriate to use a damaged and broken matzah as the Seder's centerpiece? This unusual breaking of the matzah, my dear friends, symbolizes the pain and poverty of our ancestors under Egyptian oppression. They ate crumbs and had to very carefully ration their food. Our forefathers were so poor that they had to divide and break up their meals. Eat a little bit now and save the rest for later. The broken matzah reminds us of the poverty and the hunger in those difficult times. But that was back in Egypt under the pharaohs. What about the Jewish poor today? And I don't mean literally the destitute and penniless, but I'm talking about differently. I'm talking about even a person who may be rich and affluent. Isn't there a certain level of poorness? Thank God, we don't have to eat morsels or ration our food today. In fact, we are spoiled to the point that we want and expect to get everything. Yet, amidst all of this abundance, we can still be suffering heartbreaking pain and poverty. Like our broken matzah, we are divided, incomplete, and only half of what we should be. Broken families, all kinds of, abuse going on. Sadness is going on. So let's visualize the matzah as part of a circular graph, illustrating the breakdown of the contemporary Jewish family. Demographics show that Jewish people who identify as belonging to the community comprise only about half of the whole. Many are not around. The other part of the community seems to be hiding, never to be seen at the Seder or any other Jewish function. Sadly, assimilation is taking quite a bit out of us. Even as we sit comfortably at the Seder, surrounded by family and traditions, we must remember how the other half lives. We must have empathy. We should remember that statistically, 50% of our people remain outside, uninterested, unaffiliated. Even the affiliated ones are divided between the haves and the have-nots. These are those who think wholly of themselves, who selfishly look inward only to save their own. Then there are the haves, all those of us who love and care for our brethren, the affiliated or not. And the Torah teaches us we're all really part of the whole, and we're all responsible for each other. It hurts to talk about our poverty, but knowing the problem is half the solution. We may be spiritually impoverished. Sadly, assimilation has caused a terrible breakdown in Jewish education, in a poor upbringing, with poor communal planning. It was only half a century ago that Jewish identity was taken for granted. A general feeling of family, mishpacha, kept the community together with a minimum of observances and commitment. But this is no longer so. Today we fully realize that it takes much more than bagels and lox, or even going to shul to remain part of that community. All that fiddle on the roof nostalgia doesn't keep up the tradition. A half-hearted interest is insufficient to withstand the external pressures of an open society. What is it? Only personal involvement, fulfilling and learning, being involved, being part of a community, going to classes, becoming part of the dynamic observance of mitzvahs, that will carry us into the future. On the other hand, I'm here to tell you, don't despair. Optimistically, the matzah is half full, not half empty. For each individual person is a full world, from the Talmud. We must do our best to strengthen wholesome Jewish education, involvement, and identity to prevent the matzah from crumbling any further. Our community has become, sadly, segmented and fragmented, yet we must work hard to pick up the pieces. We should reach out and keep in touch. We must welcome our knowing brethren and enjoy everything that's going on. And we should search and look high and low until we find the missing pieces, like the hiding afikoman. Well, once we find that afikoman, brings the whole Seder together. And so, my friends, this is your host, Rabbi Pearl, wishing you all a very, very wonderful, happy, kosher Passover, Aziz and Pesach. And even before Passover, make sure to invite an individual who may not have the opportunity, or a family that does not have an opportunity to have their own Seder. Bring them together. Make sure that your Seder is complete. Not only with half a matzah, then a complete afikoman, but with people, men, women, and children coming to enjoy your Seder together. This is your host, Rabbi Pearl, thanking you so much for joining us. Have a happy Passover.